G'day game makers. In this tutorial, we'll use sequences, animation curves, and other awesome GameMaker features to create this title sequence for our game. Once it is finished playing, you can press space and a nice fade out and fade in transition is played. We'll also set these up as simple functions so you can use them in any part of your game. So let's get started. Now the first thing to note is this is a dual GML and drag and drop tutorial. So at the GameMaker start page, you want to choose a new blank template and then choose your preferred method. I'm going to do GML for this one, but I will show you the equivalent drag and drop code throughout the tutorial. Now give it an appropriate name and let's go. Now I always like to go up here and change our custom order for our filter, and that'll enable the groups to not always be sorted in alphabetical order. Then what we can do is bring some images into GameMaker for the title of our mock game. Now, these images were made in Photoshop, but you can use something like GIMP or even GameMaker's own image editor to create your own. I will share these in the description so you can follow along with mine if you like. But the important thing to note is the elements of the image that you want to animate need to be separate images. So I'm going to select all these images and then drag them over and drop them into the Sprites group in GameMaker. Now, most of these have their origin up the top left, and that's fine. We can leave that on these two. But for this one, which is our game name, it's called Adventure, we need to change the origin and position it to the middle center. And that'll enable us to scale this image from that point. And we'll also need to do that for the number 2, because it's not just Adventure, it's the sequel, Adventure 2. And a title like this is great because it lets me show you how to add an additional text effect. So now let's create our animated sequence. A sequence basically enables us to manipulate assets such as sprites or sounds in a really simple way. We can have sprites moving around and scaling and rotating, and even have sound effects playing alongside. And because it's all placed on a timeline, it's really easy to set up exactly how you'd like. So let's right click on sequences and just go down and let's create our sequence. And I'm just going to call this SEQ for sequence underscore title. Now, if you've ever used something like After Effects or even Premiere, you might recognize what's happening here. We can drag over assets onto the sequence and they get placed on this track panel as asset tracks. This will also create some asset keys over here in what's called the dope sheet. And we can add properties to the track like position, rotation, or scale, and then we can animate those properties in the dope sheet and make up our sequence. So I can drag across a sprite asset. Now if I drag it up here, it's going to drop where I place it at the mouse position, but if I drag it down here to the track panel, it'll place it just here at the origin. Now when we do that, you'll see that we've also shown the asset over here in the dope sheet, and I can scroll this playhead to show what our animation looks like. Now at the moment, we only see the asset here, and that's because we're only showing this much of the asset on the timeline. And the playhead is determining what we're seeing up here in our view. So essentially what we can do is build up various assets and build up our scene and play them back using our controls here. Now one thing to note is the size of our sequence doesn't actually match the size of our asset. Now this is a HD image, it's a 1920 by 1080, so I want to set our sequence to be the same size. So up here we can change our sequence to be 1920 by 1080. Now what I like to do the origin is ensure that it's minus half of the width, so minus 960, and half of the height, so minus 540, and that'll make it easier to place this sequence in the room. So with our asset track down here, now you notice that we've created an asset key on the dope sheet at the current playhead position. And because the dope sheet shows a timeline of our sequence and when this track will be seen, we're not seeing beyond this point because this particular asset has cut off at that point. But if we want to show it over here as well, we can drag this over and then it'll appear. You can also right click and stretch the asset key the whole way. Now, this value over here is the sequence length in steps. And 60 steps is 1 second, but I'd like the intro to be a little longer, so I'm going to set this to 100. You'll notice that the asset track stretches too since we set it to stretch. Now I just want to position this in the correct spot. You could try to line up the correct position, but it might be a little hard. Instead, you can also go down here and just type -960 and -540, and that'll position it in the correct location. Now you'll notice that you might have multiple keyframes here. And if I move this over, you'll see that we've created a little animation. And that's because we had a position here, and then we dragged it over once we moved the playhead. So we ended up creating a tween between these two keyframes. Now you can easily just go here and right click on this and delete the key. And then we've only got the one at that one position. You can also drag these around if you want to place that at the start, but the position is always going to be the same for this background asset. Now let's go and drag over the title, so our adventure, and I'm just going to drop it down here in the track panel. Now, once again, we need to stretch this. At the moment, I'm still selecting this key, so just make sure you're not selecting that, and we'll just right click here and stretch the asset key, and then we can drag it into position. Now I'd like to animate this track and scale it from 0 up to 100%. And we can do that by adding a parameter track for the scale. Now we have a parameter track here already, but I'd like to add a scale one for the adventure track. And the parameter track just appears on the dope sheet, and at any step, we can always change the values. So for our adventure, we'd like our scale to be 0. And then as we move up, we're going to increase the scale up to 100%. So let's go back here to 0. Let's go on to the plus and add a parameter track. I'm just going to add scale. Now we can add a key by clicking on this little icon and it'll appear. And then we can go all the way over to the end of the track and we can add another. Now, if I scrub back and forth, there is no animation. And that's because our scale hasn't changed. It's 100% at the start and it's 100% at the end. So let's select this start key and then we'll set our scale to 0. Now this little icon will link the values, so you only need to change one. So if we change that to 0, now we have a 0 scale that moves to 100%. You can press play or you can press space to have a look at your animation. Now to give the animation some more life, we can add an animation curve to the keys. So make sure we select our scale track and then we'll toggle our curve mode on. Then we need to convert the values we have into a curve. So now we have a key at the start and a key at the end. And we have an X and a Y curve. Now you can hide these curves and then we're just looking at the X. So if we want to apply a curve to this, we want to select the key and there's a curve option here. So I'm going to change this to Bezier and I'm going to select Elastic. And then I'm going to turn that off and look at the Y. And this time I'm going to apply to the Y. Once I select the point, I'm just going to apply a back curve. So press play and have a look. And we get a nice bounce in using those curves. But if we're using this for the start of our game, I'd like a small delay before the animation plays. So I'd like to create a gap of 20 frames before and after the text shows. We can do this easily by returning to the keys view, holding Alt, and then dragging our clip so that it's 60 frames in length. And holding Alt will enable us to change the size, but it keeps the gaps in proportion. So if we make it 60 frames long, then we can just drag it to the 20th frame mark. And now we have a 20 frame gap at the start and at the end. And if you look at the curve mode, you can see that we have the gap at the start and there at the end. So when we play it, our animation is a lot snappier. And because we have that short gap at the start, it doesn't instantly play as soon as the game loads. So now that we have a shorter animation for our adventure game, you might remember that it's not just adventure, but adventure 2. So I'd like to add a number 2 here so it falls through the screen and then shakes it as it lands. So I'm going to drag in the number 2 sprite and just drop it on the track panel. Now, if I want to move this, say if I go to grab it, you'll see that I didn't actually select the number 2 and I've selected the background layer instead. So I'm going to do Control Z and undo that. And what you can do is lock down the other layers, this icon here, and then you're able to select whichever layer you like just by itself. Now, as you remember from the original shot, we want this to be large and then fall down through the screen. So let's just turn off the curve mode. And here we want to set a scale parameter. Now, at the moment, you'll see that we haven't stretched the asset. So let's just drag that into position, right click, stretch the asset. And if we look at our animation as the adventure comes down, I want this number 2 to appear at a certain point in time. Let's say around 45. And I'm going to set a scale parameter here to 1000. So it's quite large. And then we're going to have it fall down and finish around frame 75. So at this point, we want to put this back down to 100. So now we have an animation of it falling down. So there's a few things we need to fix. For example, everything before 45, we don't need to see the number. And we can fade it in using a color multiply parameter track. So let's add a key here. And we want to set this to be an alpha of 0. And up, say, around 65, we'll change our alpha at that point up to 255, which means that over time, it'll slowly fade in. Great. Now, to make the fall a little more exciting, we can also apply a curve to its animation, and that'll make it sort of hang in the air initially and then slam down at the end. So once again, let's select that scale, go to our curves, and then convert this to a curve. Now I want to isolate the X track for now and just make sure we're selecting the key at 45. You can also do that in here if you like. And this time I'm going to go to curves. And this time I'm going to select the circ. And let's just see if this does what we expect it to do. Now, the problem with this curve is what's happening is it's appearing to move in fast and then slowly become that speed. Whereas I want the opposite to happen. I want it to move in slow and then slam down at the end. So there's a way that the curves are applied are whether they're an in or an out ease. So I'm just going to undo that. Just make sure you're only selecting the number 2, otherwise it's going to apply it to both of these keys. So when you've selected number 2, go to curves, and let's change this to an ease in function. And then when we select circ, you can see that it actually curves it the other way, and we get a slow dropping and then a fast at the end. And that's what I'm looking for. Now let's isolate the Y and do the same thing. So in here, I want to select that one, go into our curves, ensure we're on our ease in, and just apply our circ. So now when we play this, we get the number 2 hanging for a while and then slamming down quickly. It just livens up the scene much more. Now, if you make a mistake and you accidentally apply it to the whole curve, remember you can always do Control Z to undo what you did in order to then select the single key. Just remember that whatever key you selected, it's going to then apply the curve to the line from that key to the next unselected key. Now, the other thing I'd like to do is have the alpha fade in a little less at the start. So let's go back to the color track. Turn off our curve mode. And I'm just going to create another key at position 55. And let's go in here. And I'm going to set the alpha to 40. So now it fades in less and then more at the end. Now, when I look at our title, that background is a little plain. So I have a nice little color effect to apply once the adventure text has appeared. So let's just close these down. Before I drag it in, just move your playhead to the start. And then when you drag that effect onto the track panel, we can then right click and stretch the asset to apply it to the whole image. Now, in order to position it correctly, let's just add a position track, and we'll change this to -960 and -540. Now we need to work out where we want to fade this in. So I'm going to put it at around the position 50. So the fading in is hidden by the number 2 that appears, and the viewer won't really notice that a color just faded in. Let's add a color multiply track here. Let's set the alpha to be 0 at this point. And then we'll go all the way over to, let's say, 80. And then we'll go and click on the alpha again, and we'll set this to 255 at this point. Now, if you scrub between those, you'll see that it fades in. But the problem is you can see the color above the number 2. And that's because of the way the layers are structured here. Whatever's on top is shown on top in the image. So we just need to grab this and let's drag this all the way down under the adventure. And now we'll have that fading in the background. So when we play it, you don't really notice that color appeared, but it still happens and it looks good at the end. Now let's test this in our game. If we go into rooms, and I was just going to click on this, press F2 and rename this to RM_title. And let's open up that room. So the first thing I want to just do is change the size of our room to match the size of our images. So down here under room settings, I'm going to change the width to be 1920 and the height to be 1080. Now if I hold down Control, I can use my wheel mouse and zoom in and out, and we can position our room like such. You can also just press the little button here to center it. Now, in order to get our sequence into the room, we need to place it on an asset layer. So let's create an asset layer over here. And I'm just going to click on it and press F2 and rename this to assets_title. And now we can drag the sequence onto that layer. And we just want to place it right up there in the corner. So the position here should be 0, 0. If you're having trouble setting that, you can double click on this and it will open up a little window and you can set the position here if you need to. Now we can press play and test that out. Great, that looks really good. But let's add a few more things. So firstly, it'd be nice if it was shown in full screen, and also if we had an option to replay it when we want to watch it again. So let's go first and fix the full screen option. Up here under game options, I'm going to select that. Go down, for me, it's under Windows, and because I'm running this via Windows, but you'll be able to go into your own settings, and under graphics, you can start it in full screen and even allow full screen switching if you need to. And you can do that with just Alt and Enter. Or if you're using the free version and running this through Opera GX, you can just press F11 and that'll make it full screen. So press OK for those and just OK and get rid of those. And now for restarting the game though, I'm going to add a control object to do that. So over under Objects, let's right click and go to Create Object. And I'm going to call it obj_game. I'll just drag this by holding the middle mouse button. Now this object, I'm just going to give an event to and set a key pressed event. And down under letters, I'm going to set it for the letter R. And all that I want to happen is that the game will restart when we press the R key. Now also for exiting the game, it'll be handy if we could just press escape. So under event, let's add a key pressed. And this time under others and under escape, I'm just going to add the function game end. Now, in order for this object to actually work, we need to drag it into the room. So let's just go to our room title, go over to our instances layer, and then I'm just going to drag this in and place it just up the top here. Now it can just be placed outside of the room dimensions. That's fine. Now if we press run again, we should see that we're in full screen, and we can press R to restart to watch our animation again. And that works great. Now to give it more impact, I'd like to shake the screen when the number 2 hits. So as it's doing this, right there, we want to shake the screen to give it some impact. So let's use one of GameMaker's new features, and that is the layer effects. And we can use the Screenshake layer effect. So in our room, I'm just going to add right up the top here, a new effect layer. Just click there and press F2. I'm going to call it effect underscore Screenshake. And I'm going to go here to the effect type and set it to Screenshake. Now you notice the screen starts shaking automatically. So because we don't want it to happen all the time, I'm going to turn off the magnitude, which is how much it shakes, by setting it to 0. And we will control it in code as to when the screen shake happens. But the reason I'm adding it here is because GameMaker needs to know which layer effects you're going to use. So before you use them in code, you need to add them to the room first so that they'll be loaded correctly and ready to use when you need them. So back in our sequence, let's work out where we want to apply this shake. So as it hits around about frame 75 is where the first time that the number 2 hits 100%. So right here, we want to apply that screen shake effect. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to use this button and add a moment. And a moment lets you run some code at this particular point in the sequence. So if we go over and we add a function, a new function is created that will run at that point in time. Now I'm going to create this function so we can use it anywhere in our game by just calling a create Screenshake. And to make it more flexible, we need to be able to set a time and a magnitude and a speed. So we'll pass those variables to the function at this time. So we can just say create Screenshake. And here with the function, we can then pass in some variables. Now, when we looked at the room, the screen shake layer has a magnitude, a shake speed, and also we want a time in there. So we can pass those values each time we call the function, and you can then have screen shakes of different sizes or length of time. So just back in here, let's go and pass the values that we're going to use. So I just want to pass in 15 for our time, 35 for the magnitude, and the default of 0.25 for the speed. That's how fast it's shaking. So now we can go and write that function. And the reason we want to do it this way is whenever we want to create a screen shake, we just have to type this line, and the function that we're going to create here will run each time. So we say function create screen shake. And here we can write the variable names representing what we're passing in. So this one is underscore time, and I use underscore to indicate it's a temporary variable. Now the other one's our magnitude, so I'm just going to call it underscore magnitude. And then the last one is our speed. Now when I write a function, I always like to put in the description. So it's written this way, and this function will just create a screen shake effect. Now here we can write the arguments so we know what they do. The first one is time, and then I like to write what the time variable is. Well, it's a real, in other words, it's a number. And what does this do? Well, it's how long to shake for. Now, the next one is for our magnitude. And this one as well is a real, and this is how intense the shake movement is. So I'm just going to move these along to make sure they're all lined up. And lastly, we have our speed. And once again, this is a real, and this is how fast to shake. So adding these to any function you write is a great way to then come back and understand what the variables do and what your function does. So just having a look back at the room, how these functions work is any layer below is affected by the effect. Now, essentially what I want to do with the Screenshake is create a layer at the top of all the other layers and then apply the Screenshake and then delete the layer afterwards. So we'll just create the layer every time we use it. And you may think, well, why don't you just use this layer? You already have one. And the reason I don't want to do that is because we would have to create this layer in every room where we want to use a Screenshake. And that's a little painful to have to do. So instead, let's just create the layer we need in the code and then delete it at the end. Remember, we're only placing it here so that GameMaker knows to load this in because we're going to use it at some point in the game. So back in our sequence, what we want to do first is just to create the effect layer. And if we already have one for some reason, we just want to get rid of it. So if layer exists, and we'll use the same name, so effect Screenshake. Well, if it does, we'll do a layer destroy, and we'll destroy that effect Screenshake layer. And we're also doing it this way because someone might have created this layer and it might not be at the right depth for us. So we'll just make sure by destroying it, and then we'll do a layer create, and we'll create it ourselves. And the thing about a layer create is we can set the depth now. Now the highest depth that we can have, which means that this will affect everything in the game, is 16,000. So let's set it at that depth. And then what we want to do is have the name of the layer. And it's called effect Screenshake. Now what we can do is actually create the effect. And I'm going to call it global Screenshake _fx. And making it a global variable means it's accessible by any other object. Now we just create it with the function fx _create. And then we have to write the name of the filter or effect. And if you middle click on fx create, you can look up all the other effects and what their names are. In this case, it's _filter _Screenshake. So this value is specific to the Screenshake filter. As I say, if you middle click, you can look up the other ones if you want to create them in the same way. So now that we've created our effect, I'm going to set some initial values. And we can do that with the function fx _set parameter. Now the first thing we put is the name of the effect, and it's global.screenshake fx. And then we need the parameters for the Screenshake. So that's such as magnitude and Screenshake. They're the two variables that the Screenshake is looking for. So g _ magnitude is the name to use. And now what value do we want to set that to? Well, we're passing it here into the function. So it's _magnitude. Now this value is specific to the Screenshake effect, and every effect has different parameters. You can generate these if you want to see what each one does. If you need more information on that, there is information in the manual on how to do that. So let's press Ctrl D and duplicate this. And that way we can just change the name of this to shake speed. Now capitals are important here. Whenever I'm using a string, the caps is important. So make sure you do it the same. And here we want to pass our speed variable into the Screenshake speed. Now the only thing we're not using is the time, and that's because this is not controlled via this effect. We have to manually do this via another means. So we'll have a look at that in a little while. But now we've set our Screenshake, we need to then apply that filter to the layer. So apply the filter to the layer, and we can do that with layer set fx. And we want to set the layer, which is our effect Screenshake layer. And what do we want to apply to it? Well, it's our global.screenshake fx. So because we're passing these values in, our time, our magnitude, our speed, they'll be applied here as parameters and then applied as a filter directly to the layer. So let's press play and test this out. Great, It's working terrifically, except we're shaking forever. That's because we never used our time variable to stop the shaking. But it's working well. So press escape. And now we can use that time variable and fade the magnitude out over time to make the effect stop. So just down here, let's now fade out the screen shake. So how I'm going to do that is create an alarm in our OBG game object. So I can say obg_game.alarm0 is equal to 1. And that then sets an alarm for alarm 0 in that object. Now alarms are basically just timers that'll run some code after a certain amount of steps. So after one step, whatever code I have in alarm 0 for object game will then run. And we'll add that code in a minute, and that'll just be a check to see if the time has expired. Now, because this is a local variable, we have no way of getting our time variable over to obj_game unless we assign it somehow. So let's assign it to our global.screenshake_time variable. So now we're using a global variable, we're setting our time, and then we can just check this to see if the time has expired. Now, how I'm going to fade out the time is just whatever the magnitude was at the start, I'm going to look at how much time has passed as a percentage and just decrease the magnitude. So for that reason, we're going to need to know the initial value of the time. So I'm going to set a Screenshake time initial and set that to time. And I'm going to also set a global.screenshake_magnitude and set that to our current magnitude. And that's because these temporary variables aren't actually passed to object game, but if we set them as globals, we can find them afterwards. Now let's go to object game, and I can middle click on this to open the object. And let's add an alarm 0. And here we'll just do our screen shake fade. So the first thing we want to do is to decrease the shake time. And we can do that just by saying global.screenshake_time --. And this will just take 1 off screen shake time. Now I talked about using this as a percentage. So firstly, we want to get the magnitude as a percentage of the initial magnitude. And all I'm saying is that I want to decrease magnitude over time based on how much time has elapsed. So I'm going to set a temporary variable saying _mag, and we'll set that to whatever our global.screenshake magnitude already is, times whatever our global.screenshake time is, divided by our global.screenshake time initial. Now, this looks kind of tricky, but all that's happening is I'm working out what time we currently have as a percentage of what the time originally was. So this number can only be between 0 and 1, and it's getting smaller each step, each time we decrease time. And because this is the percentage between 0 and 1, if we times that by whatever the magnitude was originally, this value would decrease as well, and it will go from 100% down to 0%. So now let's assign this percentage, and we can do that with that fx set parameter function that we already used. Now we need the effect or filter name, and ours was called global.screenshakefx. And what is the parameter name we want to change? Well, we already did that before. It was g_magnitude. Now make sure you spell this correctly. It will not work if you don't, including having the capital. Now what value do you want to set it to be? Well, it's _mag. So now that we've set the new magnitude, we need to know, do we keep shaking? Is our time still greater than 0? So do we keep shaking? Well, if our global.screenshake_time is greater than 0, well then yes we do. And if that's the case, let's set our alarm 0 to be 1, which means that this is all going to run again the next step. Great, so that's going to now slow that down. So if we press play, we can test that out. And then we get our shake just for a short amount of time. So the next thing is I'd like a short message to appear so the player would know that they need to press spacebar to start the game. So let's add that. Let's go back to our title sequence. And up here we have a SPR_start sprite. Now I'm going to drag that in, and this time I'm going to place it down here because that's where I want it in the room. Now I only want it to appear after all of this writing has appeared. So I'm going to drag this across to, let's say, 85, and then we'll drag this across and make sure that we only have that appearing at this point. Now it's a little bit bland if we just have it popping up, so of course we've got to animate it in. And we can do that by just looking at our position. Let's add a keyframe here. We've got one here which we don't need, so I'm going to drag this and take this over here. And now what we want to do is on the first keyframe, let's click on that, and let's just move this to the left. So now what will happen is it'll just sort of move in nice and smoothly. But let's apply a curve to make it a little bit more dynamic. So if we go into our curve mode, and then we click on our track here, our position track, and we convert that to a curve. We can see for our X that it's linear at the moment, but if we click on the key, then we can go and change this, and maybe we'll just change it to a Bezier, and let's say a quart. So now what happens is it slowly starts and then fast at the end. But I don't want that. I want it the other way. I want it to be fast here and then slow at the end. So Control Z to undo that. And instead, what you want to do is go into curves, make sure you change this from an ease in to an ease out, and then select your quart. And what's happening now is we get that fast moving in and slow at the end. Now, the only thing that's happening here is that we want to fade it in over time. So to fade in, we go and add a color multiply curve. And we want to toggle the curve mode off. And we want to set our alpha here to be 0. And at 95, we'll change it to an alpha of 255. So now we get a nice smooth movement in. Now, of course, you can set yours any way you like, but that's the basics of how to do it. Now that we have that message, we need to give the player the option to press space to start their game and move to the game room. We have our game object, so I'll manage that in there. But first, I'm just going to create a game room, but in your game, you would just move to the room where your actual game starts. So if I right click on room, I can choose create room, and I'll just call this rm_game. And I'm just going to go change the size to 1920 by 1080, which is the same size as our title room. And the other thing I want to do is just go up to background, and I'm just going to set the background to a different color. So now over in our game object, I want to note that when we move to a new room, all of the instances in our current room will be destroyed, which means our OBJ game won't be in the new room. So we won't be able to use that for our restart or our escape, for example. But we can solve that quite simply by just ticking the persistent box, and that'll just allow this instance to move between rooms. Now I'm just going to go over and create a step event, and we can use this to monitor when the player has pressed spacebar. But because we only want this to work when we're in the title room, I'm going to have a condition here that says if our room is equal to RM title. Now I'm doing a comparison here between two variables, so I'm using double equals for that. You can use a single, but in many programming languages, double equals is used for a comparison, hence why I'm doing it here. So if we're in the room, we want to check, did the player press spacebar? So if keyboard check pressed of our VK underscore space. So if the players press space, we want to allow them to move to the new room, but only if the sequence has finished playing, only if our animation has completed. So we want to check here, has the sequence finished playing? And in order to do that, we need to get the element ID of the sequence we're playing. Now over in our title room, when we place our sequence on this layer, we call this an element. And we need to get that element ID in order to check if it's actually finished playing. So GameMaker has some tools for doing that. The first thing we want to do is to get the array of layer elements. And an array is basically a collection of data that you store in one variable. And GameMaker has a function to get all the elements of a layer, and it will return it as an array. So I'm going to store that value into underscore ARR, standing for array. And the function is called layer get all elements. And we need to pass the ID of the layer or the name of it. And for us, the name was assets underscore title. And that's just taken from the layer name in the room there. So once we have that array, we can access any of the elements on it. But the way I've just shown you is there's only one element. It's just that sequence. So what we can do is get the element ID from the first array element. And that's because we know there's only one element here. So the element ID, so I'll just store it in a variable called EID. And we're going to grab the first array value, and that is the index 0. So hopefully you understand a little bit about arrays to understand what I'm doing there. This tutorial is not about how arrays work, but if the array only has one entry, we can just use index 0 to grab that entry. So once we have the element ID, we can move to the next room if the sequence is finished. And GameMaker gives us another function to check, and we can say if layer sequence is finished, and then we need to pass the sequence element ID, and that's what we just grabbed above. So underscore EID. And if that's true, if the sequence has finished playing, then we can just do our room, go to RM underscore game. So now every step of the game, we're checking if we're in this room, if we've pressed space, and if that sequence has finished playing. And if it has, then we'll move to the game room. So let's press play and test that out. So I can press space at the end, and then we move to the next room. Now, if I press R and restart, you'll see I can't press space until the animation finishes right at the end there. That looks great, but the transition to the next room is way too jarring. So instead of instantly moving there, I would like to fade the screen to black and then move to the next room and then fade out from black. And this kind of transition we can create with sequences, and we can set it up so you can just call the function whenever you need to do a transition. So instead of just going directly to the room, let's create our transition right here, and that will then start the fading out and the moving to the new room and the fading back in. So I'm going to add a function here called create transition. And I'm going to pass a variable to that function. And I'm going to pass the name of the room where we want to go to. And by doing it like this, we can pass different room names and create transitions to different rooms. Now, obviously this function doesn't exist, so let's take a copy of that and let's make that function. For now, I'm just going to create the function in the step event here to keep it all on the screen. But later on, we will need to move this into either the create event or its own script. So we're going to say function, create transition, and the variable we're passing through is our underscore room. Now, as with all functions, I like to have 3 forward slashes and have your description. So what this does is creates a fade out / fade in transition to the past room. And we'll have an argument here, and that's for our room, which is a reel. And this is the room we will move to. So all I'm going to do for now is just set a global variable. Global.targetRoom is equal to our room. And by doing this, we can use this global.targetRoom variable outside of this function. So once we do our fade out, we can change to the new room using that variable. So essentially what our code is for here is we're going to create the fade out, and then we're going to create the fade in. So let's create the fade out and fade in sequences. So over under sequences, let's right click on an existing one and we can say create sequence directly. I'm just going to call this seq_fade_out. Now the same as before, I'm going to change the size to be 1920 by 1080 and set our X origin to be -960 and our Y to be -540. Now we need to draw a black fade out. So an easy way to do that is just go up to your sprites and right click and create a sprite. And we're going to change the size of the sprite to be 1 pixel in width. And if I tab, it'll be 1 pixel in height as well. Now let's edit that and just paint it white. Now let's call this SPR_pixel. So we have a single pixel that we can use over in our fade out. So let's go back to our fade out, and I'm going to drag that single pixel onto the track panel. And then we'll right click and just stretch the asset key. Now I want this fade out to happen fairly quickly, so I'm going to change the 60 down to 40 frames. And we want to make that single pixel the width and the height of our whole sequence. So over here under our track panel, let's have a look at our scale. And I'm going to change the width to be 1920:00. And I'm going to change the height to be 1080:00. And what that'll do is change it to be the dimensions of our sequence. Now we need to position this up to the top corner. You can drag it, but sometimes you don't always get it in the right position. So I like just to go to position and set this to -960 and -540. You can also toggle the snap to grid, but depending on the dimensions of your sequence, it might not always snap to where you expect. Now I've made the pixel white so that you can have transitions of different color if you need. I just want to have a black one for now, so I'm going to go and change the color multiplier and make sure our playhead is at the start and just set this to black. But I'm going to set the alpha to be 0. And that's because our fade out starts with an alpha of 0 and eventually it increases to an alpha of 100%. So if we drag our playhead to the end and we can change the alpha now, make sure your automatically record changes is turned on. And let's drag the alpha all the way to the top. And now we have a linear change from 0 alpha up to 255. And essentially that's our fade out sequence. But what we want to do is after we've faded out, then we want to change to the new room. So we can do that by using a moment. So if we drag the playhead all the way to the end and then click on the add moment button. Now we want to make a new function here. And all we want to do is run our code to move to the new room. So we have room, go to, but what is the new room? Well, that's our global.targetRoom variable. So now that we have our fade out, let's duplicate this and do a fade in. So right click and duplicate. Change this to fade in and make sure you double click on this to open it. And this time we don't want to go from 0 alpha to 255. we want to turn it around and go from 255 to 0. So let's go and select that first key, and we'll change this to 255. And then select the last key, and we'll change this to 0. So now we have our fading in. So we have a moment still here. I'm going to double click on that and just delete it because we're already in the new room at this point. So let's go back to our create transition function, and we need to create our fade out sequence here and our fade in sequence here. Now, one thing to note about our transition is we will always want that black transition to be drawn above everything else in the room. So to ensure that happens, we will create a new layer for the sequence to play on. And we can create this new layer every time we create a transition, so that way we don't have to worry about making new layers in any of our rooms. We'll just do it in code. So right here, we can just say we want to create the layer elements for this room. And the first way we'll do that is just by creating the layer. And we can use layer create. Now we need to set the depth. I'm going to set it to -16,000. And then we need the name of the layer we want to create. I'm just going to call it transition with a capital T. So now that we have the layer for the sequence, we can create our sequence on that layer. Let's create the fade out sequence. And we can do that with layer sequence underscore create. So the first thing it wants is the layer name. Well, that is transition. And then a position. Now, because of the way we set it up, that's going to be 0 and 0. And then the name of the sequence. Well, for us, it's sequence fade out. So after this transition plays, we'll move to the next room. And then we want to play the transition for fading in. But because this all happens in the new room, we need to use another function which allows us to set up layer code to run in another room. So down where we're creating the fade in, we're going to set the layers in the new room. And GameMaker gives us a function for this. It's called layer set target room. And then we have to pass the name of the room. So for us, it's underscore room. So now any code we run on layers will apply to that room. And at the end, we then need to reset the target back. So we'll just need to reset the layer target. And we can do that with layer reset target room. So now, as mentioned, any code running in here will apply to the layer of the new room. So what do we want to do? Well, the same thing that we did here. I'm going to take a copy of this and just paste it down here. We want to create a transition layer, and then we want to create our fade in sequence. So I'll just make sure that says sequence fade in. So now we're creating our fade out. We're setting our target room, which runs at the end of fade out. And we're also setting the fade in to load when we're in the new room. Now, the reason we're doing all of this is this create transition only runs once. So we have to set it all up to run once only. And by doing it like this, we have. So let's press play and test that out. Now you'll notice that I've got an error down here and the run has failed. So one thing you might want to do is I'm just going to close all of these windows down. Just close those down, close down your sequences, and then just go into your sequences. And what can happen sometimes is when you duplicate a sequence that has a moment, GameMaker can still leave a reference to that. So what you want to make sure is that I'm going to take a copy of that and just delete that moment. And let's just go and add that again. Now press play again. Now you'll see this sometimes can happen as well. And what's happening here is the assets are getting corrupted. So I'm glad that's happened because I want to show you the solution to that. Just press escape and just make sure you clean your project. And you'll see the scripts run down here. And essentially what happens is all the assets are cleaned and the texture pages are redrawn. So let's press play again. and our sequence loads, we can press space and we get a nice fade out and a nice fade in. And it looks great. So I'll press R just to restart again, and you can see that nice fade out and back in happening. Now just a couple of things to do to clean it all up and ensure that we delete the transition layers when we've finished with our fade in. Let's go back to our fade in. Let's just add a moment here at the end, and we'll click on the add function, and we'll have a sequence fade in moment. And let's just go to the function. Now, if it doesn't jump there immediately, if you go look at your fade out events, you'll see it's already actually created there. Now we just need to add the code for it. So this runs at the end of the fade in. And essentially what we want to do is just do a layer destroy, and we want to destroy that transition layer. Now, because we're deleting that, we can actually make use of that by ensuring our transition only runs once. If we go back to our object game, go to our step event, and then at the top of our create transition, we can actually run a check here and say that we want to exit if we are already in a transition. And how do we know we're already in a transition? Well, the layer would already exist. So if the layer exists of transition, then we just want to exit. And that'll ensure we only run one transition at a time. So now you know how to build a title screen and a fade transition, which you can then call from anywhere in your game just by using this create transition and the name of the room. The only thing to do is to move this function into either its own script or simply the create event. So let's select the function. For drag and drop, we can just select the function code block. Now let's cut this out, and then right click and go to Window, add open event, and down to create. Now we just paste it here and we're all finished. Congratulations, you've added some great new tools to your coding skill set. Well, that's all from me. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.